So we're giving a message to the young here. The world is telling you that all you have is time. It doesn't matter what happens in your life or in mine. It had to go through Him first. And He's too good to do anything wrong to His children. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the high responsibility of youth. I hope you can see the building. You know, he started off with almost sounding like an atheist. Like, what's the use? What's the point? You know, and so forth. And then gradually, he has, little by little revealed more of his own personal faith. And he's doing that tonight in this section. But if you pay attention, the first 3 to 5 chapters were very philosophical, very discussing, what's the point of life? What's the point of getting up each day, and what does it accomplish, and how are we any different from those that have already died, and so forth. Well, he still does a little bit of that, but now he has, since about chapter 8, he has changed gears. And he's speaking more on the level of, well, how do we have happiness in a fallen world? How do we live a life for God, but not be crushed by the sin and the injustice and the wickedness, the corrupt governments and so forth? How do we do this? Did God mean for us to do this? And so that's the question he's kind of moved to now. And he's building up to a crescendo. And the crescendo, of course, we'll see at the end of chapter 12. And tonight we're starting that. He's going to go through this thing of okay, we're starting out young. Next time we're going to move into the description of what it's like to get older. And how do we find joy in that? And then he is going to bring it all to a conclusion at the end of chapter 12. So we're coming in for a landing in the book of Ecclesiastes. So hang in there with us and don't miss these last few chapters, because they really are the revelation of what Solomon has been getting at the whole book. How are you going to have happiness in a world that's in rebellion against God, that is in sin, and that death has entered in, disease has entered in, injustice, and so forth? So that's where we are. Look with me in verse 5 of chapter 11. Last week we looked at the study from the second part of chapter 10 all the way through 11 verse 4, and we said Solomon showed us that what happens when fools are in charge. So we talked about that, and I thought that was very enlightening and applies to a lot of life. And honestly, James in chapter 4 dealt with the same thing. I hope you've seen that there is that connection with the book of James and the book of Ecclesiastes. And now he moves into, well, what about us? The high responsibility of youth. And so we see this picking up of the theme, once again, of what we don't know. The idea of the lack of our knowledge as mortals, as sinners, created beings in this world. And so I thought it'd be good for us, because that's where he starts, to think through. I've referred several times to this thread of not knowing. So I thought it'd be good for us, as he opens it up for us tonight with that idea, to trace that idea so you can see the thread that I'm talking about. So the first thing that I believe that he would tell us as young people, but I also think that we need to have wisdom to advise young people. I will hope that this will correct us if we carry into life some of these false ideas that the world tells us to tell young people. Okay? So think about that as we move along. But first he tells us as a young person, and by that, obviously, that would apply to teens, but I think he's primarily referring to young adults, young men, young women, and so forth. But I think personally, a young teenager is an adult in the making. We ought to kick out the term adolescence. There is no such thing. God tells us to grow up. There's childhood and there's adulthood. Adolescence is not something really that we ever needed, and we're reaping the whirlwind because we did that. So let's rejoice in our limited knowledge. So he says in verse 5, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So he sets up this comparison, this analogy. He says, so you do not know where the spirit of the child comes from. Well, we know it comes from God, but when does it enter? Nobody knows. Even with our modern technology, we cannot say when the spirit enters the womb and in the heart of a child, in the life of the child. Now, of course, you and I would say it's probably a conception, but scientifically we can't prove when the Spirit's there, but we know that's when life is there, so why not? But that's between God and His creation, quite honestly. But so that you get the point, though. You can't know that. And so Solomon says, guess what? You don't know what God is doing all the time. It's not possible. So let's take for a few moments this evening to trace Solomon's theme of not knowing, so that we can clearly draw out his intended meaning, because he has now completed this thread. He's been building this thread of not knowing, and I believe this is the place where he now concludes what he wants to say about that. So in chapter 8 is where I believe this theme of not knowing what God is doing begins. And he says in verse 7 of chapter 8, for he does not know what he is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? So he is telling us there in chapter 8, verse 7, that we're unable to determine how things will be. If we go back in that context, we could start our reading in chapter 8, verse 2. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps the command will know no evil thing. And the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be. For who can tell him how it will be? So the point in chapter 8 was, be careful in being hasty to oppose the king or the authority, the government. Because he says God has granted a certain level of authority. And who is going to say to the king, what are you doing? That might not come home very well for us, okay? And so he also is saying in verse 7 of chapter 8, you don't know how this is going to turn out. You don't know how it will be. So he appeals there to for us to humble ourselves and to realize you have limited knowledge. So be careful here. Then he moves on to chapter 8, verse 17, where he says, then I saw all the work of God that man cannot find out. the work of God, or the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it. So even the wise man who is seeking the wisdom of God, he says, can't know everything that God's doing. It's not possible. So once again, what do we see that he's doing here? He's telling us, sit down. You don't know what God is doing all the time. Back down and submit to the sovereign rule of God. Ecclesiastes 9:1. But all of this I've laid to heart, Solomon says, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. Chapter 9, verse 12. For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. So the children of man are snared at an evil time, when it suddenly falls on them. You can't know when a disaster is going to happen. Those people did not know that Hamas was launching this attack. They were in their homes. Some were standing at the bus stop. Some driving down the street. They didn't know. You and I can't know. You can try to be prepared, but we don't know. Ecclesiastes 10, verse 14 and 15. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Now in chapter 10, verse 14 and 15, we see a connection begin. And that is that he says in verse 14, the fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be. So he contrasts the proud, arrogant person who, although he has no idea what God is doing, talks anyway. And just talks and talks and talks and multiplies words when he ought to be quiet, and learn the things of God. Okay. But then he makes a connection with that idea in verse 15 to what we said as laziness or unproductivity. So in verse 15 he says, the toil of a fool. So the fool is the one that talks a lot, but doesn't know the wisdom of God. But he also doesn't want to work. The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. In other words, he doesn't want to work, and he always finds a reason. He says it's going to rain. Remember that? He says there's clouds. It's going to rain. And he says, oh, well, it's going to get dark or it's going to get cold. You can't work. This kind of thing. And here, verse 15, chapter 10, he says, it's just too toilsome. It's too hard. And so there's this connection between disobedience. That's what you need to see. What is meant by unproductivity? Disobedience. What did God create man to do? Work. Yeah. Well, and that was part of the curse. But even before the curse, man was to till the garden, to take care of the garden. When we get to heaven, we're not going to float around on clouds with little golden harps, We're going to go to work. Now, what are we going to do? I don't know. But we will be managing God's creation. And there'll be work involved. But the part of the curse was work became toil. So now, rather than tilling the garden and enjoying it and it not being hard labor and toil, fighting against weeds and so forth, now it's hard and it's laborious and toilsome. It's punishing for man to get the nourishment and things that he needs. So there's that connection. Disobedience. So the fool has lots of words, but not the wisdom of God. What does that lead to? disobedience and laziness. It's what he wants us to see. So in chapter 10, verse 14 and 15, he connects those two ideas. Now, in verse 11, verse 2, he's going to continue that idea. A portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. Another reason why you should be obedient and hardworking is so that you can help others. Give a portion to 7 or 8. Why? Once again, you don't know what's getting ready to happen. It could be a blizzard. It could be a terrible winter. It could be a drought. And suddenly, the people that you helped may be saving you. So you see this community and obedience of the plan of God in a fallen, sinful world. Care about each other. Work not only for yourself, but for the glory of God and for others. We see that connection beginning to build. And part of that is grows or stems from our obedience to God, the wisdom of obeying God. Then verse 5 of chapter 11, that's part of our text tonight. As you do not know the way the Spirit moves or comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So he reminds us again, God is in control of this. You don't know the future. You don't know what it holds. Just like you don't know how God connects the spirit of a human being with their body. Okay. But once again, that premise is established to lead us to obedience and against idleness, we might say. He says in verse 6, in the morning, sow your seed, and at evening, withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. So he connects that lack of knowledge to obedience to God. He says, so get up. Sow your seed in the morning. Sow it in the evening. We might, if we compare it to last week, sow it in case before it rains. Sow it after it rains. In other words, don't look for excuses. He says the lazy, foolish person says, well, where's the city? I don't even know how to get there. One comedian one time said that when his wife sent him down to cook breakfast and for the kids, and he said, well, do we have pans? Do we have pots? Where are the eggs? Sometimes, we don't want to do it, so we act like we don't know how, or we don't know where it is. Well, Solomon's actually doing that. He's saying the foolish man finds a reason not to obey, not to work, not to do what God created him to do. We might bring it down to the nitty-gritty and just say, if you want to be happy in the world, get up and work. Put your hand to something, and let God bless you. He says, you don't know which will be blessed, whether this or that. Just get at it. He might bless both. Francis Schaeffer, dealt with a lot of issues as a theologian and a counselor. His writings dealing with people that had depression and debilitating depression. And he started in Switzerland the Brie Institute, and people came there and they learned and grew. But some came there quite honestly, for psychological help, from deliverance from depression and so forth. One of the first things that Schaeffer did, they had gardens where the food was grown for the institute, and they would go. They were assigned a place in the garden to go and work, whether it was plowing, picking, watering, pulling weeds, whatever, because Francis Schaeffer knew, even from a theological perspective, you need to put your hand to something. You want to get out of this hole. Don't lay in the hole. Get working. Get doing something, we might say, that God has commanded you to do so that you can begin to enjoy the reasons for which you were created. So I think it's profound that he has this in here. Verse 9 of chapter 11, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So he says, basically, he brings this not knowing to a conclusion. And that is, you obey God even though you don't have all the answers, even though you don't know all these things. Because you know what? Here's what you can know. You will be judged for how you live. So isn't that interesting how he runs that thread? And then we see that, number 2, rejoice in your opportunities. In verse 6, in the morning you sow your seed, and at the evening withhold not your hand. So we've read that section. Verse 7, light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Remember the word, we said vanity has some nuance. For a lot of times we've talked about vanity meaning emptiness. But don't limit it to that. Because it also has the idea of breath or vapor. So much so that James even interprets that way in James, where he says our life is but a vapor. He's getting that from Solomon out of the Book of Ecclesiastes. So if we read this in the idea that vapor, a mist, something that is very gone quickly, a vapor in the morning mist, and as the sun rises up and burns it off, it's only there a very brief time. If we see it that way, then we can see that in chapter 11, verse 8, look with me there and read it that way. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is a vapor. It's empty, but not empty. I don't think that's really the right way to think of that. It's a vapor. It's a mist. It's short. And then he goes on in verse 9, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart, the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are a vapor. They are brief. So, rejoice in your opportunities is what I see him saying here in verses 6 through 8. Rather than bringing sorrow, our limited knowledge is cause for rejoicing in the opportunities that God brings into our lives through his divine providence. In verse 6, we are encouraged to sow our seed and not to allow lack of complete knowledge to hold us back. We are told to sow the seeds of a godly life, trusting in God's omniscience rather than our own knowledge. We do not know which he will prosper, those sowed in the morning or those sowed in the evening. And if we do not understand his point, Solomon gives us another analogy concerning life lived for God through wisdom. He tells us in verse 7 and 8 that living is good. Living is good. Quote, seeing the sun each day is a reason to rejoice in God. Do not take any day for granted, but embrace and be thankful for each one, he says in verse 8. Even though there are many dark days in a life, find cause to rejoice in God's blessing of the gift of a new day, because life is terribly short and we should never waste it. This is what he's saying. He's saying, light is sweet. and it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. In other words, I opened my eyes again today, and that's a reason to be grateful, to embrace life and understand that you see the progression of thought. We might think that, well, how can I rejoice? I don't have all the knowledge I need. But Solomon says, actually, you don't need all that knowledge. God has that. What you and I need to do is to learn the wisdom of God and do what we were created to do. Rejoice in your limited knowledge. He's not saying don't learn, don't grow. Earlier he said pursue wisdom. So yes, grow. But you can't grow into God. We're not Mormons. We're not New Agers. We're not teaching that we are little gods or that we become little gods. There's only one God, and He has all knowledge. So we should never want all of that knowledge. We should humbly worship and love and adore the one who does have all that knowledge. You might look at it this way. It doesn't matter what happens in your life or in mine. It had to go through Him first. And He's too good to do anything wrong to His children. So you can trust Him. So rejoice. Maybe we might say, relax. Trust Him. Then we see that moves into, okay, well then when you get up in the morning, hey, you got another day. Another what? Opportunity. A day filled with opportunities. Things that you can do. You can get up, sow your seed. Sow it in the evening. Sow it in the morning. Sow it. Don't let the clouds stop you. Don't let anything stop you. Be diligent. Who knows, he's saying, what God will prosper. Maybe he'll prosper both alike. He might prosper. We say some people have the Midas touch. And some people, it seems like, doesn't matter what they touch, God blesses it. Remember Joseph? It didn't matter what Joseph did. He was working for his dad. He's working for Potiphar. He's working for the Pharaoh. He's working for the jailer. It didn't matter where that man went. He prospered. So now that's not me. and you might be saying, well, it's not me. But the Lord does bless us all in different ways, doesn't He? He gives each of us different opportunities. But if our attitude is not right, if our faith is not right, then we're going to miss many of the opportunities that God has given us. And aren't these things that young people need to know? Yeah. We all need this. But boy, wouldn't it be good to enter into youth, into young adulthood with a mindset like that?
Oh, yeah.
How much time we wasted because we didn't know these things. Solomon is trying to help us to live joyfully for God. So young man and young woman, do not waste the life God has given you complaining about your lack of opportunity or how someone else has more than you do. Solomon calls us to rejoice in whatever opportunities God has given you. However few or however many that may be. To whom much is given, much will be required. Some people, from the day they are born, they're born, as we say, with a silver spoon in their mouth. They have tons of opportunities. If they write a book, somebody's going to publish it. Why? Because they're part of the such and such family. Or as one pastor said, that they wanted to bring on an associate, and they told the associate, well, now, if you want to write a book and get published, you need to take this church. Know about that, Pete, don't you? And, that's the reality. It is true. And that doesn't necessarily mean that whoever pastors that church did it for that reason. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying opportunities vary. Some people have very little. I know of a young man who grew up in poverty, but he knows literature as well as anybody I know. He is very highly read. But do you think his teachers recommended him to scholarships at any universities? No. Because he was dirt poor growing up. Now, he can sit around and moan and whine and complain about the injustice and blah, all that. Or you can take whatever it is that God did give you and make something out of it. Invest your life instead of wasting it. This is your life. Do not waste it. Make the most of what you have been given. And then lastly, rejoice in the brevity of your life. That's a hard one, isn't it? Rejoice in the brevity of your life. I don't know if many of us feel that way, do we? They say, well, don't you want to go to heaven? Well, it's like one man said, well, yeah, but if you're getting up a load, I'll wait. That's what Solomon would say, I believe. I don't know. And yes, we should live for heaven. And that's not what Solomon is saying. But he is saying God's given you a life here. And the blessings of the Old Testament, many of which are tangible here now. Now, yes, the New Testament spiritual terms many of those spiritual, but not all. I don't think he's saying we still live here. We still need God. We still suffer from these same things. Why would these not more apply to us than they did to the Old Testament saints? To me, it does. So rejoice in the brevity of life. Paul did. He said, if I stay, then it's good for you. But if I go, it's better for me because I'll be with Christ. So, like one old preacher said, somebody threatened him with a gun. He said, don't threaten me with eternal life. You take my life, I'll go right on to heaven. I'll be right with God. I'll be with Christ. So it'll be better. But he says, rejoice in the brevity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart. No, remove depression from your heart. Remove downcasted spirit, as David said. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Look to God, who is your strength. This is David doing this kind of thing. Although David predates Ecclesiastes, but he was certainly doing it. So he's saying, cheer your heart, embrace your life. Realize that, life is short. That's why you need to get on with it. Now, if ever there was maybe a generation or two that needed to hear this, we're there. When we got, and you've seen it, you drive by an intersection and a 22-year-old man is standing there with a sign saying, we'll work for food. I'm like, okay, give me the cardboard and go ahead. It's time for you to do it. Okay? There's just that generation, unfortunately, that are, 35 and living in their parents' basement and won't hold down a job and so forth. That would rather, 35-year-old men playing video games and instead of being married. Demetrius and I were talking about an issue last week that many of the bigger, ministers are concerned about, that many of the young generation of young men don't want to get married. And the young women don't want to get married. Why? Well, number one, we've told them that for some time. We've told them for some time, don't get married. Don't worry about it. You got plenty of time. Solomon says you don't.
That's right.
And that's what I told Demetrius. I said, I never told him that. Because I never believed that. I've always believed, grow up, get married, have your children, and live for the Lord. Now, you say, well, is it God's will that every person be married? No. Jesus said that to some it is given that they not be. But by and large, That's a few. That is a minority group. Most of us are going to be married, and we need to get on with life. Many are sitting back, riding off of a lifestyle that their parents are paying for. When Solomon tells you, hey, you don't need to wait till you know everything and have everything figured out. You don't have to, well, I don't have all the perfect opportunities, so I can't get off my sofa. And, life is short. You're going to do something, we need to get on with it, don't we? Because it won't be long. It'll be over. So this is what he's saying. Remember, he tells you, pursue your heart and fill it with joy. Remove the pain and the vexation from your spirit, and remove the pain from your body. Take some ibuprofen. Yeah. But remember, God will call into judgment all that you do. So make those choices wisely and for Him. So the teens, 20, 30-somethings, are given another powerful reason to joyfully take hold of their lives and live them for God, and that is its brevity. In other words, you do not have much time. So many young adults will not act unless they are confident of having full knowledge of resources and outcome. Solomon says to them, do not waste your life waiting. You do not know, nor can you know, nor should you know everything. You are not God, but you will answer to God for what you did or for what you failed to do, Solomon says. So we're given a message to the young here. The world is telling you that all you have is time. You can do what you want to do whenever you want and what you want. But that's not what God is telling you. God is telling you, grow up, get up, and go do what God's called you to do before your time is up. And so I think that's a message that young people need to hear today. Not to pick on them. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about they've been fed a lie. They've been fed the lie that they can just live off of the government's going to take care of you. Your parents are going to take care of you. Your grandparents are going to take care of you. Somebody's going to take care of you. So you just live it up. When that's not true. And we're about to find out the hard way. And we're not doing them any favors, are we? Because the truth is, what happens when they're 35 or 40 and they realize, you know what, my life's, I got to get on with it. You're 40. Your strength, your vitality. I mean, if I had to go to seminary and work 40 hours a week now, while I'm a full-time student and being a father and volunteering in the church, I couldn't do it. I did it then because I was young. You guys did too, didn't you? In all kinds of ways. If you hadn't taken advantage of those opportunities, when you had the strength to do it, you couldn't do it now. And that's what Solomon's saying. Rejoice in your youth. Don't waste it. Don't fall into this lie that, well, they got to sow their oats. They got to live for a while, in the world and all that, so they can come back.
That's why they go to college.
That's why you go to college, so you can party and do all this. That's wrong. Solomon says, serve the Lord in the days of your youth. And you don't have any reason to look back and regret. Let's pray. Father, we ask for your blessings and to go with us.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to our latest video. Go ahead and click that little thumb so you can like that video, as well as on the bottom right hand corner, click that little bell to subscribe and receive notifications. Thank you again so much for tuning in, supporting our video ministry here at Cognitive Church.